Chapter 8 of Pollyanna by Eleanor H. Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by The Story Girl. Chapter 8. Pollyanna Pays a Visit. It was not long before life at the Harrington homestead settled into something like order. Though not exactly the order that Miss Polly had at first prescribed. Pollyanna sewed, practiced, read aloud, and studied cooking in the kitchen, it is true, but she did not give to any of these things quite so much time as had first been planned. She had more time, also, to just live, as she expressed it, for almost all of every afternoon from 2 until 6 o'clock was hers to do with as she liked, provided she did not like to do certain things already prohibited by Aunt Polly. It is a question, perhaps, whether all this leisure time was given to the child as a relief to Pollyanna from work, or as a relief to Aunt Polly from Pollyanna. Certainly, as those first July days passed, Miss Polly found occasion many times to ejaculate, "What an extraordinary child!" And certainly the reading and sewing lessons found her at their conclusion each day somewhat dazed and wholly exhausted. Nancy in the kitchen fared better. She was not dazed nor exhausted. Wednesdays and Saturdays came to be, indeed, red-letter days to her. There were no children in the immediate neighborhood of the Harrington homestead for Pollyanna to play with. The house itself was on the outskirts of the village, and though there were other houses not far away, they did not chance to contain any boys or girls near Pollyanna's age. This, however, did not seem to disturb Pollyanna in the least.
"Oh, no, I don't mind it at all," she explained to Nancy. "I'm happy just to walk around and see the streets and the houses and watch the people. I just love people. Don't you, Nancy?"
"Well, I can't say I do. All of 'em," retorted Nancy tersely. Almost every pleasant afternoon found Pollyanna begging for an errand to run, so that she might be off for a walk in one direction or another. And it was on these walks that frequently she met the man. To herself, Pollyanna always called him the man, no matter if she met a dozen other men the same day. The man often wore a long black coat and a high silk hat, two things that the just men never wore. His face was clean-shaven and rather pale, and his hair, showing below his hat, was somewhat gray. He walked erect and rather rapidly, and he was always alone, which made Pollyanna vaguely sorry for him. Perhaps it was because of this that she one day spoke to him.
"How do you do, sir? Isn't this a nice day?" she called cheerily as she approached him.
The man threw a hurried glance about him, then stopped uncertainly.
"Did you speak to me?"
he asked in a sharp voice.
"Yes, sir,"
beamed Pollyanna.
"I say, it's a nice day, isn't it?"
"Eh? Oh.
He grunted and strode on again. Pollyanna laughed. He was such a funny man, she thought. The next day she saw him again.
"'Tisn't quite so nice as yesterday, but it's pretty nice," she called out cheerfully.
"Eh? Oh.
Grunted the man as before, and once again Pollyanna laughed happily. When for the third time Pollyanna accosted him in much the same manner, the man stopped abruptly.
"See here, child. Who are you, and why are you speaking to me every day?"
"I'm Pollyanna Whittier, and I thought you looked lonesome. I'm so glad you stopped. Now we're introduced. only I don't know your name yet."
"Well, of all the—"
The man did not finish his sentence, but strode on faster than ever. Pollyanna looked after him with a disappointed droop to her usually smiling lips.
Maybe he didn't understand. But that was only half an introduction. I don't know his name yet,
she murmured as she proceeded on her way. Pollyanna was carrying calf's foot jelly to Mrs. Snow today. Miss Polly Harrington always sent something to Mrs. Snow once a week. She said she thought that it was her duty, inasmuch as Mrs. Snow was poor, sick, and a member of her church. It was the duty of all the church members to look out for her, of course. Miss Polly did her duty by Mrs. Snow usually on Thursday afternoons. Not personally, but through Nancy. Today Pollyanna had begged the privilege, and Nancy had promptly given it to her in accordance with Miss Polly's orders. "And it's glad that I am to get rid of it," Nancy had declared in private afterwards to Pollyanna. "Though it's a shame to be tucking the job off onto you, poor lamb. So it is, so it is."
"But I'd love to do it, Nancy."
"Well, you won't, after you've done it once," predicted Nancy sourly.
"Why not?"
"Because nobody does. If folks weren't sorry for her, there wouldn't a soul go near her from morning till night. She's that cantankerous. All is, I pity her daughter, what has to take care of her."
"But why, Nancy?"
Nancy shrugged her shoulders. "Well, in plain words, it's just that nothing whatever has happened right in Miss Snow's eyes. Even the days of the week ain't run to her mind. If it's Monday, she's bound to say she wished 'twas Sunday. And if you take her jelly, you're pretty sure to hear she wanted chicken. But if you did bring her chicken, she'd be just hankering for lamb broth."
"Why, what a funny woman!"
laughed Pollyanna.
"I think I shall like to go see her. She must be so surprising and different. I love different folks."
Well, Miss Snow's different, all right. I hope for the sake of the rest of us," Nancy had finished grimly. Pollyanna was thinking of these remarks today as she turned in at the gate of the shabby little cottage. Her eyes were quite sparkling indeed at the prospect of meeting this different Mrs. Snow. A pale-faced, tired-looking young girl answered her knock at the door.
"How do you do?"
began Pollyanna politely.
"I'm from Miss Polly Harrington, and I'd like to see Mrs. Snow, please."
"Well, if you would, you're the first one that ever liked to see her," muttered the girl under her breath. But Pollyanna did not hear this. The girl had turned and was leading the way through the hall to a door at the end of it. In the sick room, after the girl had ushered her in and closed the door, Pollyanna blinked a little before she could accustom her eyes to the gloom. Then she saw, dimly outlined, a woman half sitting up in the bed across the room. Pollyanna advanced at once.
"How do you do, Mrs. Snow? Aunt Polly says she hopes you are comfortable today, and she's sent you some calf's foot jelly."
"Dear me, jelly," murmured a fretful voice. "Of course I'm very much obliged, but I was hoping 'twould be lamb broth today." Pollyanna frowned a little.
"Why, I thought it was chicken you wanted when folks brought you jelly," she said.
"What?" The sick woman turned sharply.
"Why, nothing much,"
apologized Pollyanna hurriedly.
"And of course it doesn't really make any difference. It's only that Nancy said it was chicken you wanted when we brought jelly, and lamb broth when we brought chicken. But maybe 'twas the other way and Nancy forgot."
The sick woman pulled herself up till she sat erect in the bed, a most unusual thing for her to do, though Pollyanna did not know this. "Well, Miss Impertinence, who are you?" she demanded. Pollyanna laughed gleefully.
"Oh, that isn't my name, Mrs. Snow, and I'm so glad 'tisn't, too. That would be worse than Hepzibah, wouldn't it? I'm Pollyanna Whittier, Miss Polly Harrington's niece, and I've come to live with her. That's why I'm here with the jelly this morning."
All through the first part of this sentence, the sick woman had sat interestedly erect, but at the reference to the jelly she fell back on her pillow listlessly. "Very well, thank you. Your aunt is very kind, of course, but my appetite isn't very good this morning, and I was wanting lamb—" She stopped suddenly, then went on with an abrupt change of subject. "I never slept a wink last night. Not a wink."
"Oh, dear, I wish I didn't,"
sighed Pollyanna, placing the jelly on the little stand and seating herself comfortably in the nearest chair.
"You lose such a lot of time just sleeping. Don't you think so?"
"Lose time? Sleeping?" exclaimed the sick woman.
"Yes, when you might be just living, you know. It seems such a pity we can't live nights, too."
Once again the woman pulled herself erect in her bed. "Well, if you ain't the amazing young one!" she cried. "Here, do you go to that window and pull up the curtain," she directed. "I should like to know what you look like." Pollyanna rose to her feet, but she laughed a little ruefully.
"Oh, dear, then you'll see my freckles, won't you?" she sighed as she went to the window. "And just when I was being so glad it was dark and you couldn't see 'em. There, now you can. Oh!" she broke off excitedly as she turned back to the bed. "I'm so glad you wanted to see me, because now I can see you. They didn't tell me you were so pretty."
"Me? Pretty?" scoffed the woman bitterly.
"Why, yes. Didn't you know it?"
cried Pollyanna. "Well, no, I didn't," retorted Mrs. Snow dryly. Mrs. Snow had lived 40 years, and for 15 of those years she had been too busy wishing things were different to find much time to enjoy things as they were.
"Oh, but your eyes are so big and dark, and your hair's all dark too, and curly," cooed Pollyanna. "I love black curls. That's one of the things I'm going to have when I get to heaven. And you've got 2 little red spots in your cheeks. Why, Mrs. Snow, you are pretty. I should think you'd know it when you looked at yourself in the glass."
"The glass?" snapped the sick woman, falling back on her pillow. "Yes, well, I hain't done much prinking before the mirror these days. And you wouldn't if you was flat on your back as I am."
"Why, no, of course not," agreed Pollyanna sympathetically. "But wait, just let me show you," she exclaimed, skipping over to the bureau and picking up a small hand glass. On the way back to the bed she stopped, eyeing the sick woman with a critical gaze. "I reckon maybe, if you don't mind, I'd like to fix your hair just a little before I let you see it," she proposed. "May I fix your hair, please?"
"Why, I suppose so, if you want to," permitted Mrs. Snow grudgingly. "But 'twon't stay, you know."
"Oh, thank you. I love to fix people's hair," exulted Pollyanna, carefully laying down the hand glass and reaching for a comb. "I shan't do much today, of course. I'm in such a hurry for you to see how pretty you are. But someday I'm going to take it all down and have a perfectly lovely time with it," she cried, touching with soft fingers the waving hair above the sick woman's forehead. For 5 minutes Pollyanna worked swiftly, deftly, combing a refractory curl into fluffiness, perking up a drooping ruffle at the neck, or shaking a pillow into plumpness so that the head might have a better pose. Meanwhile, the sick woman, frowning prodigiously and openly scoffing at the whole procedure, was, in spite of herself, beginning to tingle with a feeling perilously near to excitement. "There!" panted Pollyanna, hastily plucking a pink from a vase near by and tucking it into the dark hair where it would give the best effect. "Now I reckon we're ready to be looked at." And she held out the mirror in triumph. Grunted the sick woman, eyeing her reflection severely. "I like red pinks better than pink ones. But then, it'll fade anyhow before night, so what's the difference?" "But I should think you'd be glad they did fade," laughed Pollyanna. "'Cause then you can have the fun of getting some more. I just love your hair fluffed out like that," she finished with a satisfied gaze. "Don't you?"
Maybe. Still, 'twon't last, with me tossing back and forth on the pillow as I do."
"Of course not. And I'm glad, too," nodded Pollyanna cheerfully. "Because then I can fix it again. Anyhow, I should think you'd be glad it's black. Black shows up so much nicer on a pillow than yellow hair like mine does."
"Maybe, but I never did set much store by black hair. Shows gray too soon," retorted Mrs. Snow. She spoke fretfully, but she still held the mirror before her face.
"Oh, I love black hair. I should be so glad if I only had it,"
sighed Pollyanna. Mrs. Snow dropped the mirror and turned irritably.
"Well, you wouldn't. Not if you were me. You wouldn't be glad for black hair nor anything else if you had to lie here all day as I do."
Pollyanna bent her brows in a thoughtful frown.
"Why, 'twould be kind of hard to do it then, wouldn't it?"
she mused aloud.
"Do what?"
"Be glad about things."
"Be glad about things? When you're sick in bed all your days? Well, I should say it would," retorted Mrs. Snow. "If you don't think so, just tell me something to be glad about, that's all."
To Mrs. Snow's unbounded amazement, Pollyanna sprang to her feet and clapped her hands.
"Oh, goody! That'll be a hard one, won't it? I've got to go now, but I'll think and think all the way home, and maybe the next time I come I can tell it to you. Goodbye. I've had a lovely time. Goodbye,"
she called again as she tripped through the doorway.
"Well, I never! Now what does she mean by that?"
ejaculated Mrs. Snow, staring after her visitor. By and by she turned her head and picked up the mirror, eyeing her reflection critically.
"That little thing has got a knack with hair, and no mistake," she muttered under her breath. "I declare, I didn't know it could look so pretty. But then what's the use?" she sighed, dropping the little glass into the bedclothes and rolling her head on the pillow fretfully.
A little later, when Milly, Mrs. Snow's daughter, came in, the mirror still lay among the bedclothes, though it had been carefully hidden from sight. "Why, Mother, the curtain is up!" cried Milly, dividing her amazed stare between the window and the pink in her mother's hair.
"Well, what if it is?
snapped the sick woman.
"I needn't stay in the dark all my life if I am sick, need I?"
"Why, no, of course not," rejoined Milly in hasty conciliation as she reached for the medicine bottle. "It's only... Well, you know very well that I've tried to get you to have a lighter room for ages, and you wouldn't." There was no reply to this. Mrs. Snow was picking at the lace on her nightgown. At last she spoke fretfully.
"I should think somebody might give me a new night-dress, instead of lamb broth for a change."
"Why, Mother!" No wonder Milly quite gasped aloud with bewilderment. In the drawer behind her at that moment lay 2 new night-dresses that Milly for months had been vainly urging her mother to wear. End of Chapter 8. Recording by The Story Girl. Chapter 9 of Pollyanna by Eleanor H. Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by The Story Girl. Chapter 9, which tells of the man. It rained the next time Pollyanna saw the man. She greeted him, however, with a bright smile.
"It isn't so nice today, is it?"
she called blithesomely.
"I'm glad it doesn't rain always, anyhow."
The man did not even grunt this time, nor turn his head. Pollyanna decided that of course he did not hear her. The next time, therefore, which happened to be the following day, she spoke up louder. She thought it particularly necessary to do this anyway, for the man was striding along, his hands behind his back and his eyes on the ground, which seemed to Pollyanna preposterous in the face of the glorious sunshine and the freshly washed morning air. Pollyanna, as a special treat, was on a morning errand today.
"How do you do?"
she chirped.
"I'm so glad it isn't yesterday, aren't you?"
The man stopped abruptly. There was an angry scowl on his face.
"See here, little girl. We might just as well settle this thing right now, once for all," he began testily. "I've got something besides the weather to think of. I don't know whether the sun shines or not."
Pollyanna beamed joyously.
"No, sir, I thought you didn't. That's why I told you."
"Yes, well, what?"
he broke off sharply, in sudden understanding of her words.
"I say, that's why I told you. So you would notice it, you know. That the sun shines and all that. I knew you'd be glad it did if you only stopped to think of it. And you didn't look a bit as if you were thinking of it."
"Well, of all the..."
ejaculated the man with an oddly impotent gesture. He started forward again, but after the second step he turned back, still frowning.
"See here, why don't you find someone your own age to talk to?"
"I'd like to, sir, but there aren't any round here, Nancy says. Still, I don't mind so very much. I like old folks just as well, maybe better sometimes, being used to the Ladies' Aid so."
The Ladies' Aid, indeed. Is that what you took me for?"
The man's lips were threatening to smile, but the scowl above them was still trying to hold them grimly stern. Pollyanna laughed gleefully.
"Oh, no, sir. You don't look a mite like a Ladies' Aider. Not but that you're just as good, of course. Maybe better," she added in hurried politeness. "You see, I'm sure you're much nicer than you look."
The man made a queer noise in his throat.
"Well, of all the..."
he ejaculated again as he turned and strode on as before. The next time Pollyanna met the man, His eyes were gazing straight into hers with a quizzical directness that made his face look really pleasant, Pollyanna thought.
"Good afternoon,"
he greeted her a little stiffly.
"Perhaps I'd better say right away that I know the sun is shining today."
But you don't have to tell me,
nodded Pollyanna brightly.
I knew you knew it, just as soon as I saw you.
"Oh, you did you?"
Yes, sir. I saw it in your eyes, you know, and in your smile.
Grunted the man as he passed on. The man always spoke to Pollyanna after this, and frequently he spoke first, though usually he said little but good afternoon. Even that, however, was a great surprise to Nancy, who chanced to be with Pollyanna one day when the greeting was given. "Sakes alive, Miss Pollyanna," she gasped. "Did that man speak to you?"
Why, yes, he always does. Now,
smiled Pollyanna. "He always does? Goodness, do you know who he is?" demanded Nancy. Pollyanna frowned and shook her head.
I reckon he forgot to tell me one day. You see, I did my part of the introducing, but he didn't.
Nancy's eyes widened. "But he never speaks to anybody, child. He ain't for years, I guess, except when he just has to, for business and all that. He's John Pendleton. He lives all by himself in the big house on Pendleton Hill. He won't even have anyone round to cook for him. Comes down to the hotel for his meals 3 times a day. I know Sally Miner, who waits on him, and she says he hardly opens his head enough to tell what he wants to eat. She has to guess it more'n half the time. Only it'll be something cheap. She knows that without no tellin'." Pollyanna nodded sympathetically.
I know. You have to look for cheap things when you're poor. Father and I took meals out a lot. We had beans and fish balls most generally. We used to say how glad we were we liked beans. That is, we said it specially when we were looking at the roast turkey place, you know. That was 60 cents. Does Mr. Pendleton like beans?
"Like 'em? What if he does or don't? Why, Miss Pollyanna, he ain't poor. He's got loads of money, John Pendleton has, from his father. There ain't nobody in town as rich as he is. He could eat dollar bills if he wanted to, and not know it." Pollyanna giggled.
As if anybody could eat dollar bills and not know it, Nancy, when they come to try to chew 'em.
"No, I mean he's rich enough to do it," shrugged Nancy. "He ain't spending his money, that's all. He's a-saving of it."
Oh, for the heathen,
surmised Pollyanna.
How perfectly splendid. That's denying yourself and taking up your cross. I know, Father told me.
Nancy's lips parted abruptly, as if there were angry words all ready to come. But her eyes, resting on Pollyanna's jubilantly trustful face, saw something that prevented the words being spoken. She vouchsafed. Then, showing her old-time interest, she went on. "But say, it is queer, his speaking to you, honestly, Miss Pollyanna. He don't speak to no one, and he lives all alone in a great big lovely house all full of just grand things, they say. Some says he's crazy, and some just cross, and some says he's got a skeleton in his closet."
"Oh, Nancy,"
shuddered Pollyanna.
"How can you keep such a dreadful thing? I should think he'd throw it away."
Nancy chuckled. That Pollyanna had taken the skeleton literally instead of figuratively, she knew very well, but perversely she refrained from correcting the mistake. "And everybody says he's mysterious," she went on. Some years he just travels, week in and week out, and it's always in heathen countries, Egypt and Asia and the desert of Sahara, you know.
Oh, a missionary,
nodded Pollyanna. Nancy laughed oddly. Well, I didn't say that, Miss Pollyanna. When he comes back, he writes books. Queer, odd books, they say, about some gimcrack he's found in them heathen countries. But he don't never seem to want to spend no money here. Leastways, not for just livin'.
Of course not, if he's saving it for the heathen,
declared Pollyanna.
But he is a funny man, and he's different too, just like Mrs. Snow, only he's a different.
Well, I guess he is, rather, chuckled Nancy.
I'm gladder ever now, anyhow, that he speaks to me,
sighed Pollyanna contentedly. End of Chapter 9. Read by the Story Girl. Chapter 10 of Pollyanna by Eleanor H. Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by the Story Girl. Chapter 10. A Surprise for Mrs. Snow. The next time Pollyanna went to see Mrs. Snow, she found that lady, as at first, in a darkened room. "It's the little girl from Miss Polly's, mother," announced Milly in a tired manner. Then Pollyanna found herself alone with the invalid.
"Oh, it's you, is it?"
asked a fretful voice from the bed.
"I remember you. Anybody'd remember you, I guess, if they saw you once. I wish you had come yesterday. I wanted you yesterday."
Did you? Well, I'm glad 'tisn't any farther away from yesterday than today is, then,
laughed Pollyanna, advancing cheerily into the room and setting her basket carefully down on a chair.
"My, but aren't you dark here, though? I can't see you a bit,"
she cried, unhesitatingly crossing to the window and pulling up the shade.
"I want to see if you fixed your hair like I did. Oh, you haven't. But never mind, I'm glad you haven't after all, 'cause maybe you'll let me do it, later. But now I want you to see what I've brought you."
The woman stirred restlessly.
"Just as if how it looks would make any difference in how it tastes,"
she scoffed. But she turned her eyes toward the basket.
"Well, what is it?"
"Guess. What do you want?"
Pollyanna had skipped back to the basket. Her face was alight. The sick woman frowned.
"Why, I don't want anything as I know of," she sighed. "After all, they all taste alike."
Pollyanna chuckled.
"This won't. Guess. If you did want something, what would it be?"
The woman hesitated. She did not realize it herself, but she had so long been accustomed to wanting what she did not have, that to state offhand what she did want seemed impossible, until she knew what she had. Obviously, however, she must say something. This extraordinary child was waiting.
"Well, of course there's lamb broth."
"I've got it!"
crowed Pollyanna.
"But that's what I didn't want,"
sighed the sick woman, sure now of what her stomach craved.
"It was chicken I wanted."
"Oh, I've got that too,"
chuckled Pollyanna. The woman turned in amazement.
"Both of them?"
she demanded.
"Yes, and calf's foot jelly,"
triumphed Pollyanna.
"I was just bound you should have what you wanted for once, so Nancy and I fixed it. Oh, of course, there's only a little of each, but there's some of all of 'em. I'm so glad you did want chicken," she went on contentedly, as she lifted the 3 little bowls from her basket. "You see, I got to thinking on the way here. What if you should say tripe or onions or something like that I didn't have? Wouldn't it have been a shame when I tried so hard?" She laughed merrily.
There was no reply. The sick woman seemed to be trying mentally to find something she had lost.
"There, I'm to leave them all," announced Pollyanna as she arranged the 3 bowls in a row on the table. "Like enough it'll be lamb broth you want tomorrow. How do you do today?" she finished in polite inquiry.
"Very poorly, thank you," murmured Mrs. Snow, falling back into her usual listless attitude. "I lost my nap this morning. Nellie Higgins next door's begun music lessons, and her practicing drives me nearly wild. She was at it all the morning, every minute. I'm sure I don't know what I shall do."
Pollyanna nodded sympathetically.
"I know. It is awful. Mrs. White had it once. One of my ladies' aiders, you know. She had rheumatic fever, too, at the same time, so she couldn't thrash round. She said 'twould have been easier if she could have. Can you?"
"Can I what?"
"Thrash round. Move, you know, so as to change your position when the music gets too hard to stand."
Mrs. Snow stared a little.
"Why, of course I can move. Anywhere. In bed," she rejoined a little irritably.
"Well, you can be glad of that then, anyhow, can't you?" nodded Pollyanna. "Mrs. White couldn't. You can't thrash when you have rheumatic fever, though you want to something awful, Mrs. White says. She told me afterwards she reckoned she'd have gone raving crazy if it hadn't been for Mr. White's sister's ears, being deaf so."
"Sister's ears? What do you mean?"
Pollyanna laughed.
"Well, I reckon I didn't tell at all, and I forgot you didn't know Mrs. White. You see, Miss White was deaf, awfully deaf, and she came to visit 'em and to help take care of Mrs. White in the house. Well, they had such an awful time making her understand anything that after that, every time the piano commenced to play across the street, Mrs. White felt so glad she could hear it that she didn't mind so much that she did hear it, 'cause she couldn't help thinking how awful 'twould be if she was deaf and couldn't hear anything, like her husband's sister. You see, she was playing the game too. I told her about it."
"The game?"
Pollyanna clapped her hands.
"There! I most forgot. But I've thought it up, Mrs. Snow, what you can be glad about."
"Glad about? What do you mean?"
"Why, I told you I would. Don't you remember? You asked me to tell you something to be glad about. Glad, you know, even though you did have to lie here abed all day."
"Oh," scoffed the woman. "That. Yes, I remember that, but I didn't suppose you were in earnest any more than I was."
"Oh, yes, I was," nodded Pollyanna triumphantly. "And I found it, too. But 'twas hard. It's all the more fun, though, always, when 'tis hard. And I will own up, honest to true, that I couldn't think of anything for a while. Then I got it."
"Did you really? Well, what is it?"
Mrs. Snow's voice was sarcastically polite. Pollyanna drew a long breath.
"I thought how glad you could be that other folks weren't like you, all sick in bed like this, you know," she announced impressively.
Mrs. Snow stared. Her eyes were angry.
"Well, really!" she ejaculated then.
in not quite an agreeable tone of voice.
"And now I'll tell you the game,"
proposed Pollyanna, blithely confident.
"It'll be just lovely for you to play. It'll be so hard. And there's so much more fun when it is hard. You see, it's like this."
And she began to tell of the missionary barrel, the crutches, and the doll that did not come. The story was just finished when Milly appeared at the door. "Your aunt is wanting you, Miss Pollyanna," she said with dreary listlessness. "She telephoned to the Harlows across the way. She says you're to hurry, that you've got some practicing to make up before dark." Pollyanna rose reluctantly.
"All right,"
she sighed.
"I'll hurry."
Suddenly she laughed.
"I suppose I ought to be glad I've got legs to hurry with, hadn't I, Mrs. Snow?"
There was no answer. Mrs. Snow's eyes were closed. But Milly, whose eyes were wide open with surprise, saw that there were tears on the wasted cheeks.
"Goodbye,"
flung Pollyanna over her shoulder as she reached the door.
"I'm awfully sorry about the hair. I wanted to do it, but maybe I can next time."
One by one the July days passed. To Pollyanna they were happy days indeed. She often told her aunt joyously how very happy they were, whereupon her aunt would usually reply wearily, "Very well, Pollyanna, I'm gratified, of course, that they are happy, but I trust that they are profitable as well. Otherwise I should have failed signally in my duty." Generally Pollyanna would answer this with a hug and a kiss, a proceeding that was still always most disconcerting to Miss Polly. But one day she spoke. It was during the sewing hour.
"Do you mean that it wouldn't be enough then, Aunt Polly, that they should be just happy days?"
she asked wistfully. "That is what I mean, Pollyanna."
"They must be profitable as well?"
"Certainly."
"What is being profitable?"
"Why, it's just being profitable. Having profit, something to show for it, Pollyanna. What an extraordinary child you are."
"Then just being glad isn't profitable?"
questioned Pollyanna a little anxiously. "Certainly not."
"Oh dear. Then you wouldn't like it, of course. I'm afraid now you won't ever play the game, Aunt Polly."
"Game? What game?"
"Why, that Father—"
Pollyanna clapped her hand to her lips.
Nothing,"
she stammered. Miss Polly frowned. "That will do for this morning, Pollyanna," she said tersely, and the sewing lesson was over. It was that afternoon that Pollyanna, coming down from her attic room, met her aunt on the stairway.
"Why, Aunt Polly, how perfectly lovely!" she cried. "You were coming up to see me. Come right in. I love company," she finished, scampering up the stairs and throwing her door wide open. Now Miss Polly had not been intending to call on her niece. She had been planning to look for a certain white wool shawl in the cedar chest near the east window. But to her unbounded surprise now, she found herself not in the main attic before the cedar chest, but in Pollyanna's little room, sitting in one of the straight-backed chairs. So many, many times since Pollyanna came, Miss Polly had found herself like this, doing some utterly unexpected, surprising thing, quite unlike the thing she had set out to do. "I love company,"
said Pollyanna again, flitting about as if she were dispensing the hospitality of a palace.
"Especially since I've had this room, all mine, you know. Oh, of course I had a room always, but 'twas a hired room, and hired rooms aren't half as nice as owned ones, are they? And of course I do own this one, don't I?"
"Why, yes, Pollyanna," murmured Miss Polly, vaguely wondering why she did not get up at once and go to look for that shawl.
"And of course now I just love this room, even if it hasn't got the carpets and curtains and pictures that I'd been want—"
With a painful blush, Pollyanna stopped short. She was plunging into an entirely different sentence when her aunt interrupted her sharply. "What's that, Pollyanna?"
Nothing, Aunt Polly. Truly, I didn't mean to say it."
"Probably not," returned Miss Polly coldly. "But you did say it, so suppose we have the rest of it."
"But it wasn't anything, only that I'd been kind of planning on pretty carpets and lace curtains and things, you know. But of course—"
"Planning on them?" interrupted Miss Polly sharply. Pollyanna blushed still more painfully.
"I ought not to have, of course, Aunt Polly," she apologized. "It was only because I'd always wanted them and hadn't had them, I suppose. Oh, we'd had 2 rugs in the barrels, but they were little, you know, and one had ink spots and the other holes, and there never were only those 2 pictures, the one the good one we sold and the bad one that broke. Of course, if it hadn't been for all that, I shouldn't have wanted them so. Pretty things, I mean. And I shouldn't have got to planning all through the hall that first day how pretty mine would be here, and but truly, Aunt Polly, it wasn't but just a minute, a few minutes, before I was being glad that the bureau didn't have a looking-glass, because it didn't show my freckles, and there couldn't be a nicer picture than the one out my window there. And you've been so good to me that—"
Miss Polly rose suddenly to her feet. Her face was very red. "That will do, Pollyanna," she said stiffly. "You have said quite enough, I'm sure." The next minute she had swept down the stairs, and not until she reached the first floor did it suddenly occur to her that she had gone up into the attic to find a white wool shawl in the cedar chest near the east window. Less than 24 hours later, Miss Polly said to Nancy crisply, "Nancy, you may move Miss Pollyanna's things downstairs this morning to the room directly beneath. I have decided to have my niece sleep there for the present."
"Yes, ma'am," said Nancy aloud.
"Oh, glory!" said Nancy to herself. To Pollyanna, a minute later, she cried joyously, "And won't you just be listening to this, Miss Pollyanna? You're to sleep downstairs in the room straight under this. You are. Pollyanna actually grew white.
"You mean— Why, Nancy, not really? Really and truly?"
"I guess you'll think it's really and truly," prophesied Nancy exultingly, nodding her head to Pollyanna over the armful of dresses she had taken from the closet. "I'm told to take down your things, and I'm going to take 'em too, 'fore she gets a chance to change her mind." Pollyanna did not stop to hear the end of this sentence. At the imminent risk of being dashed headlong, she was flying downstairs 2 steps at a time. Bang went 2 doors and a chair before Pollyanna at last reached her goal. Aunt Polly.
"Oh, Aunt Polly, did you mean it? Really? Why, that room's got everything. The carpet and curtains and 3 pictures besides the one outdoors too, 'cause the windows look the same way. Oh, Aunt Polly."
"Very well, Pollyanna. I'm gratified that you like the change, of course. But if you think so much of all those things, I trust you will take proper care of them, that's all. Pollyanna, please pick up that chair. And you banged 2 doors in the last half-minute." Miss Polly spoke sternly, all the more sternly because, for some inexplicable reason, She felt inclined to cry, and Miss Polly was not used to feeling inclined to cry. Pollyanna picked up the chair.
Yes, I know I banged 'em, those doors, she admitted cheerfully. You see, I just found out about the room, and I reckon you'd have banged doors if...
Pollyanna stopped short and eyed her aunt with new interest.
Aunt Polly, did you ever bang doors?
I hope not, Pollyanna. Miss Polly's voice was properly shocked.
Why, Aunt Polly, what a shame.
Pollyanna's face expressed only concerned sympathy. A shame, repeated Aunt Polly, too dazed to say more.
Why, yes. You see, if you'd felt like banging doors, you'd have banged 'em, of course. And if you didn't, that must have meant that you weren't ever glad over anything. Or you would have banged 'em. You couldn't have helped it. And I'm so sorry you weren't ever glad over anything.
Pollyanna, gasped the lady, but Pollyanna was gone, and only the distant bang of the attic stairway door answered for her. Pollyanna had gone to help Nancy bring down her things. Miss Polly, in the sitting room, felt vaguely disturbed. But then, of course she had been glad over some things. End of Chapter 10. Read by the Story Girl. Chapter 11 of Pollyanna by Eleanor H. Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by the Story Girl. Chapter 11. Introducing Jimmy. August came. August brought several surprises and some changes, none of which, however, were really a surprise to Nancy. Nancy, since Pollyanna's arrival, had come to look for surprises and changes. First, there was the kitten. Pollyanna found the kitten mewing pitifully some distance down the road. When systematic questioning of the neighbors failed to find anyone who claimed it, Pollyanna brought it home at once, as a matter of course.
And I was glad I didn't find anyone who owned it, too, she told her aunt in happy confidence. 'Cause I wanted to bring it home all the time. I love kitties. I knew you'd be glad to let it live here.
Miss Polly looked at the forlorn little gray bunch of neglected misery in Pollyanna's arms and shivered. Miss Polly did not care for cats, not even pretty, healthy, clean ones. Pollyanna, what a dirty little beast! And it's sick, I'm sure, and all mangy and flea-y.
I know it, poor little thing,
crooned Pollyanna tenderly, looking into the little creature's frightened eyes.
And it's all trembly, too. It's so scared. You see, it doesn't know yet that we're going to keep it, of course.
No, nor anybody else, retorted Miss Polly, with meaning emphasis.
Oh, yes, they do,
nodded Pollyanna, entirely misunderstanding her aunt's words.
I told everybody we should keep it if I didn't find where it belonged. I knew you'd be glad to have it. Poor little lonesome thing.
Miss Polly opened her lips and tried to speak, but in vain. The curious, helpless feeling that had been hers so often since Pollyanna's arrival had her now fast in its grip.
Of course I knew,
hurried on Pollyanna gratefully,
that you wouldn't let a dear little lonesome kitty go hunting for a home when you'd just taken me in. And I said so to Mrs. Ford when she asked if you'd let me keep it. Why, I had the lady's aid, you know, and Kitty doesn't have anybody. I knew you'd feel that way.
She nodded happily as she ran from the room. But Pollyanna, remonstrated Miss Polly. "I don't—" But Pollyanna was already halfway to the kitchen, calling,
"Nancy, Nancy, just see this dear little kitty that Aunt Polly is going to bring up along with me."
and Aunt Polly, in the sitting room, who abhorred cats, fell back in her chair with a gasp of dismay, powerless to remonstrate. The next day it was a dog, even dirtier and more forlorn perhaps than was the kitten, and again Miss Polly, to her dumbfounded amazement, found herself figuring as a kind protector and an angel of mercy, a role that Pollyanna so unhesitatingly thrust upon her as a matter of course, that the woman, who abhorred dogs even more than she did cats, if possible, found herself, as before, powerless to remonstrate. When, in less than a week, however, Pollyanna brought home a small, ragged boy and confidently claimed the same protection for him, Miss Polly did have something to say. It happened after this wise. On a pleasant Thursday morning, Pollyanna had been taking calf's foot jelly again to Mrs. Snow. Mrs. Snow and Pollyanna were the best of friends now. Their friendship had started from the third visit Pollyanna had made, the one after she had told Mrs. Snow of the game. Mrs. Snow herself was playing the game now with Pollyanna. To be sure, she was not playing it very well. She had been sorry for everything for so long that it was not easy to be glad for anything now. But under Pollyanna's cheery instructions and merry laughter at her mistakes, she was learning fast. Today even, to Pollyanna's huge delight, she had said that she was glad Pollyanna brought calf's foot jelly, because that was just what she had been wanting. She did not know that Milly, at the front door, had told Pollyanna that the minister's wife had already that day sent over a great bowlful of that same kind of jelly. Pollyanna was thinking of this now, when suddenly she saw the boy. The boy was sitting in a disconsolate little heap by the roadside, whittling half-heartedly at a small stick.
"Hello,"
smiled Pollyanna engagingly. The boy glanced up, but he looked away again at once. "Hello yourself," he mumbled. Pollyanna laughed.
"Now you don't look as if you'd be glad even for calf's foot jelly,"
she chuckled, stopping before him. The boy stirred restlessly, gave her a surprised look, and began to whittle again at his stick, with the dull, broken-bladed knife in his hand. Pollyanna hesitated, then dropped herself comfortably down on the grass near him. In spite of Pollyanna's brave assertion that she was used to ladies' aiders and didn't mind, she had sighed at times for some companion of her own age. Hence her determination to make the most of this one.
"My name's Pollyanna Whittier,"
she began pleasantly.
"What's yours?"
Again the boy stirred restlessly. He even almost got to his feet, but he settled back. "Jimmy Bean," he grunted with ungracious indifference.
"Good. Now we're introduced. I'm glad you did your part. Some folks don't, you know. I live at Miss Polly Harrington's house. Where do you live?"
"Nowhere."
"Nowhere? Why, you can't do that. Everybody lives somewhere,"
asserted Pollyanna.
"Well, I don't. Just now. I'm hunting up a new place."
"Oh, where is it?"
The boy regarded her with scornful eyes.
"Silly. As if I'd be a-hunting for it, if I knew."
Pollyanna tossed her head a little. This was not a nice boy, and she did not like to be called silly. Still, he was somebody besides old folks.
Where did you live before? She queried.
Well, if you ain't the beatin' for asking questions, sighed the boy impatiently.
I have to be, retorted Pollyanna calmly. Else I couldn't find out a thing about you. If you'd talk more, I wouldn't talk so much.
The boy gave a short laugh. It was a sheepish laugh, and not quite a willing one, but his face looked a little pleasanter when he spoke this time.
All right, then. Here goes. I'm Jimmy Bean, and I'm 10 years old going on 11. I came last year to live at the orphan's home, but they've got so many kids there ain't much room for me. And I wa'n't never wanted anyhow, I don't believe. So I've quit. I'm going to live somewheres else. But I hain't found the place yet. I'd like a home. Just a common one, you know, with a mother in it, instead of a matron. If you has a home, you has folks. And I ain't had folks since Dad died. So I'm a-huntin' now. I've tried 4 houses, but they didn't want me. Though I said I expected to work, course. There, is that all you want to know?
The boy's voice had broken a little over the last 2 sentences.
Why, what a shame, sympathized Pollyanna. And didn't there anybody want you? Oh dear. I know just how you feel because after my father died too, there wasn't anybody but the Ladies' Aid for me, until Aunt Polly said she'd take...
Pollyanna stopped abruptly. The dawning of a wonderful idea began to show in her face.
Oh, I know just the place for you, she cried. Aunt Polly'll take you. I know she will. Didn't she take me? And didn't she take Fluffy and Buffy when they didn't even have anyone to love them or any place to go? And they're only cats and dogs. Oh, come, I know Aunt Polly'll take you. You don't know how good and kind she is.
Jimmy Bean's thin little face brightened.
Honest Injun? Would she now? I'd work, you know, and I'm real strong.
He bared a small bony arm.
Of course she would. Why, my Aunt Polly is the nicest lady in the world. Now that my mama has gone to be a heaven angel, and there's rooms, heaps of 'em,
she continued, springing to her feet and tugging at his arm.
It's an awful big house. Maybe, though,
she added a little anxiously as they hurried on.
Maybe you'll have to sleep in the attic room. I did it first. But there's screens there now, so 'twon't be so hot, and the flies can't get in either to bring in the germ things on their feet. Did you know about that? It's perfectly lovely. Maybe she'll let you read the book if you're good. If you're bad. And you've got freckles, too,
with a critical glance.
So you'll be glad there isn't any looking glass. And the outdoor picture is nicer than any wall one could be, so you won't mind sleeping in that room at all, I'm sure,
panted Pollyanna, finding suddenly that she needed the rest of her breath for purposes other than talking.
Gory,
exclaimed Jimmy Bean tersely and uncomprehendingly, but admiringly. Then he added,
I shouldn't think anybody who could talk like that running would need to ask no questions to fill up time with.
Pollyanna laughed.
Well, anyhow, you can be glad of that, she retorted. For when I'm talking, you don't have to.
When the house was reached, Pollyanna unhesitatingly piloted her companion straight into the presence of her amazed aunt.
Oh, Aunt Polly, she triumphed. Just look-a here. I've got something ever so much nicer even than Fluffy and Buffy for you to bring up. It's a real live boy. He won't mind a bit sleeping in the attic at first, you know, and he says he'll work, but I shall need him most of the time to play with, I reckon.
Miss Polly grew white, then very red. She did not quite understand, but she thought she understood enough. Pollyanna, what does this mean? Who is this dirty little boy? Where did you find him? She demanded sharply. The dirty little boy fell back a step and looked toward the door. Pollyanna laughed merrily.
There, if I didn't forget to tell you his name. I'm as bad as the man. And he is dirty too, isn't he? I mean the boy is. Just like Fluffy and Buffy were when you took them in. But I reckon he'll improve all right by washing, just as they did. And, oh, I most forgot again.
She broke off with a laugh.
This is Jimmy Bean, Aunt Polly.
Well, what is he doing here?
Wait, Aunt Polly, I just told you.
Pollyanna's eyes were wide with surprise.
He's for you. I brought him home so he could live here, you know. He wants a home and folks. I told him how good you were to me and to Fluffy and Buffy, and that I knew you would be to him, because of course he's even nicer than cats and dogs.
Miss Polly dropped back in her chair and raised a shaking hand to her throat. The old helplessness was threatening once more to overcome her. With a visible struggle, however, Miss Polly pulled herself suddenly erect.
That will do, Pollyanna. This is a little the most absurd thing you've done yet. As if tramp cats and mangy dogs weren't bad enough, but you must needs bring home ragged little beggars from the street who—
There was a sudden stir from the boy. His eyes flashed and his chin came up. With 2 strides of his sturdy little legs, he confronted Miss Polly fearlessly.
I ain't a beggar, Marm, and I don't want nothing of you. I was calculating to work, of course, for my board and keep. I wouldn't have come to your old house anyhow if this here girl hadn't have made me, telling me how you was so good and kind that you'd just be dying to take me in. So there.
And he wheeled about and stalked from the room with a dignity that would have been absurd, had it not been so pitiful.
Oh, Aunt Polly,
choked Pollyanna.
Why, I thought you'd be glad to have him here. I'm sure I should think you'd be glad.
Miss Polly raised her hand with a peremptory gesture of silence. Miss Polly's nerves had snapped at last. The good and kind of the boy's words were still ringing in her ears, and the old helplessness was almost upon her, she knew. Yet she rallied her forces with the last atom of her willpower.
Pollyanna,
she cried sharply.
Will you stop using that everlasting word glad? It's glad, glad, glad from morning till night until I think I shall grow wild.
From sheer amazement, Pollyanna's jaw dropped.
My Aunt Polly, she breathed. I should think you'd be glad to have me
She broke off, clapping her hand to her lips and hurrying blindly from the room. Before the boy had reached the end of the driveway, Pollyanna overtook him.
Boy, Jimmy Bean, I want you to know how sorry I am,
she panted, catching him with a detaining hand.
Sorry nothing. I ain't blaming you,
retorted the boy sullenly.
But I ain't no beggar,
he added with sudden spirit.
Of course you aren't. But you mustn't blame Auntie,
appealed Pollyanna.
Probably I didn't do the introducing right anyhow, and I reckon I didn't tell her much who you were. She is good and kind, really. She's always been, but I probably didn't explain it right. I do wish I could find some place for you, though.
The boy shrugged his shoulders and half turned away.
Never mind. I guess I can find one myself. I ain't no beggar, you know.
Pollyanna was frowning thoughtfully. Of a sudden she turned, her face illumined.
Say, I'll tell you what I will do. The Ladies' Aid meets this afternoon. I heard Aunt Polly say so. I'll lay your case before them. That's what Father always did when he wanted anything. Educating the heathen and new carpets, you know.
The boy turned fiercely.
Well, I ain't a heathen or a new carpet. Besides, what is a Ladies' Aid?
Pollyanna stared in shocked disapproval.
Why, Jimmy Bean, wherever have you been brought up? Not to know what a lady's aid is?
Oh, all right, if you ain't tellin', grunted the boy, turning and beginning to walk away indifferently.
Pollyanna sprang to his side at once.
Why, it's just a lot of ladies that meet and sew and give suppers and raise money and talk. That's what a lady's aid does. They're awfully kind. That is, most of mine was, back home. I haven't seen this one here, but they're always good, I reckon. I'm going to tell them about you this afternoon.
Again the boy turned fiercely.
Not much you will. Maybe you think I'm going to stand round and hear a whole lot of women call me a beggar instead of just one. Not much.
Oh, but you wouldn't be there, argued Pollyanna quickly. I'd go alone, of course, and tell them.
You would?
Yes, and I'd tell it better this time,
hurried on Pollyanna, quick to see the signs of relenting in the boy's face.
And there'd be some of 'em I know that would be glad to give you a home.
I'd work, don't forget to say that, cautioned the boy.
Of course not,
promised Pollyanna happily, sure now that her point was gained.
Then I'll let you know tomorrow.
Where?
By the road, where I found you today, near Mrs. Snow's house.
All right, I'll be there.
The boy paused before he went on slowly.
Maybe I'd better go back then, for tonight, to the home. You see, I hain't no other place to stay, and I didn't leave till this morning. I slipped out. I didn't tell 'em I wasn't comin' back, else they'd pretend I couldn't come. Though I'm thinkin' they won't do no worryin' when I don't show up sometime. They ain't like folks, you know. They don't care.
I know, nodded Pollyanna with understanding eyes.
But I'm sure when I see you tomorrow, I'll have just a common home and folks that do care all ready for you. Goodbye,
she called brightly as she turned back toward the house. In the sitting-room window at that moment, Miss Polly, who had been watching the two children, followed with somber eyes the boy until a bend of the road hid him from sight. Then she sighed, turned and walked listlessly upstairs. And Miss Polly did not usually move listlessly. In her ears still was the boy's scornful, "You was so good and kind." In her heart was a curious sense of desolation, as of something lost. End of Chapter 11. Recording by The Story Girl. Chapter 12 of Pollyanna by Eleanor H. Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by The Story Girl. Chapter 12. Before the Ladies' Aid. Dinner, which came at noon in the Harrington homestead, was a silent meal on the day of the Ladies' Aid meeting. Pollyanna, it is true, tried to talk, but she did not make a success of it, chiefly because 4 times she was obliged to break off a "glad" in the middle of it, much to her blushing discomfort. The 5th time it happened, Miss Polly moved her head wearily. "There, there, child, say it if you want to," she sighed. "I'm sure I'd rather you did than not if it's going to make all this fuss." Pollyanna's puckered little face cleared.
"Oh, thank you. I'm afraid it would be pretty hard not to say it. You see, I've played it so long."
"You've what?" demanded Aunt Polly.
"Played it. The game, you know, But Father—"
Pollyanna stopped with a painful blush at finding herself so soon again on forbidden ground. Aunt Polly frowned and said nothing. The rest of the meal was a silent one. Pollyanna was not sorry to hear Aunt Polly tell the minister's wife over the telephone a little later that she would not be at the Ladies' Aid meeting that afternoon, owing to a headache. When Aunt Polly went upstairs to her room and closed the door, Pollyanna tried to be sorry for the headache, but she could not help feeling glad that her aunt was not to be present that afternoon when she laid the case of Jimmy Bean before the Ladies' Aid. She could not forget that Aunt Polly had called Jimmy Bean a little beggar, and she did not want Aunt Polly to call him that before the Ladies' Aid. Pollyanna knew that the Ladies' Aid met at 2:00 in the chapel next the church, not quite half a mile from home. She planned her going, therefore, so that she should get there a little before 3.
"I want them all to be there," she said to herself. "Else the very one that wasn't there might be the one who would be wanting to give Jimmy Bean a home. And of course 2:00 always means 3, really, to Ladies' Aiders."
Quietly, but with confident courage, Pollyanna ascended the chapel steps, pushed open the door, and entered the vestibule. A soft babble of feminine chatter and laughter came from the main room. Hesitating only a brief moment, Pollyanna pushed open one of the inner doors. The chatter dropped to a surprised hush. Pollyanna advanced a little timidly. Now that the time had come, she felt unwontedly shy. After all, these half-strange, half-familiar faces about her were not her own dear Ladies' Aid.
"How do you do, Ladies' Aiders?"
she faltered politely.
"I'm Pollyanna Whittier. I reckon some of you know me, maybe. Anyway, I do you, only I don't know you altogether this way."
The silence could almost be felt now. Some of the ladies did know this rather extraordinary niece of their fellow member, and nearly all had heard of her, but not one of them could think of anything to say just then.
I've come to lay the case before you,"
stammered Pollyanna after a moment, unconsciously falling into her father's familiar phraseology. There was a slight rustle. Did your aunt send you, my dear?" asked Mrs. Ford, the minister's wife. Pollyanna colored a little.
"Oh, no. I came all by myself. You see, I'm used to Ladies' Aiders. It was Ladies' Aiders that brought me up, with Father."
Somebody tittered hysterically, and the minister's wife frowned. "Yes, dear. What is it?"
"Well, it's Jimmy Bean,"
sighed Pollyanna.
"He hasn't any home except the orphan one, and they're full and don't want him anyhow, he thinks. So he wants another. He wants one of the common kind, that has a mother instead of a matron in it. Folks, you know, that'll care. He's 10 years old, going on 11. I thought some of you might like him. To live with you, you know."
"Well, did you ever?"
murmured a voice, breaking the dazed pause that followed Pollyanna's words. With anxious eyes, Pollyanna swept the circle of faces about her.
"Oh, I forgot to say, he will work,"
she supplemented eagerly. Still there was silence. Then, coldly, one or two women began to question her. After a time they all had the story and began to talk among themselves, animatedly, not quite pleasantly. Pollyanna listened with growing anxiety. Some of what was said she could not understand. She did gather, after a time, however, that there was no woman there who had a home to give him, though every woman seemed to think that some of the others might take him, as there were several who had no little boys of their own already in their homes. But there was no one who agreed herself to take him. Then she heard the minister's wife suggest timidly that they, as a society, might perhaps assume his support and education instead of sending quite so much money this year to the little boys in far-away India. A great many ladies talked then, and several of them talked all at once, and even more loudly and more unpleasantly than before. It seemed that their society was famous for its offering to Hindu missions, and several said they should die of mortification if it should be less this year. Some of what was said at this time Pollyanna again thought she could not have understood, too, for it sounded almost as if they did not care at all what the money did, so long as the sum opposite the name of their society in a certain report headed the list. And of course that could not be what they meant at all. But it was all very confusing and not quite pleasant, so that Pollyanna was glad indeed when at last she found herself outside in the hushed, sweet air. Only she was very sorry, too, for she knew it was not going to be easy, or anything but sad, to tell Jimmy Bean tomorrow that the Ladies' Aid had decided that they would rather send all their money to bring up the little India boys than to save out enough to bring up one little boy in their own town, for which they would not get a bit of credit in the report, according to the tall lady who wore spectacles.
Not but that it's good, of course, to send money to the heathen, and I shouldn't want 'em not to send some there,
sighed Pollyanna to herself as she trudged sorrowfully along.
But they acted as if little boys here weren't any account. Only little boys, way off. I should think, though, they'd rather see Jimmy Bean grow than just a report.
End of Chapter 12. Read by the Story Girl. Chapter 13 of Pollyanna by Eleanor H. Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by the Story Girl. Chapter 13. In Pendleton Woods. Pollyanna had not turned her steps toward home when she left the chapel. She had turned them, instead, toward Pendleton Hill. It had been a hard day, for all it had been a vacation one, as she termed the infrequent days when there was no sewing or cooking lesson. And Pollyanna was sure that nothing would do her quite so much good as a walk through the green quiet of Pendleton Woods. Up Pendleton Hill, therefore, she climbed steadily, in spite of the warm sun on her back.
I don't have to get home till 5:30 anyway, she was telling herself. And it'll be so much nicer to go around by the way of the woods, even if I do have to climb to get there.
It was very beautiful in the Pendleton Woods, as Pollyanna knew by experience. But today it seemed even more delightful than ever, notwithstanding her disappointment over what she must tell Jimmy Bean tomorrow.
I wish they were up here. All those ladies who talked so loud,
sighed Pollyanna to herself, raising her eyes to the patches of vivid blue between the sunlit green of the treetops.
Anyhow, if they were up here, I just reckon they'd change and take Jimmy Bean for their little boy, all right,
she finished, secure in her conviction, but unable to give a reason for it, even to herself. Suddenly Pollyanna lifted her head and listened. A dog had barked some distance ahead. A moment later he came dashing toward her, still barking.
"Hello, doggy. Hello."
Pollyanna snapped her fingers at the dog and looked expectantly down the path. She had seen the dog once before, she was sure. He had been then with the man, Mr. John Pendleton. She was looking now, hoping to see him. For some minutes she watched eagerly, but he did not appear. Then she turned her attention toward the dog. The dog, as even Pollyanna could see, was acting strangely. He was still barking, giving little short, sharp yelps as if of alarm. He was running back and forth, too, in the path ahead. Soon they reached a side path, and down this the little dog fairly flew, only to come back at once, whining and barking.
"Oh, that isn't the way home,"
laughed Pollyanna, still keeping to the main path. The little dog seemed frantic now. Back and forth, between Pollyanna and the side path he vibrated, barking and whining pitifully. Every quiver of his little brown body and every glance from his beseeching brown eyes were eloquent with appeal, so eloquent that at last Pollyanna understood, turned and followed him. Straight ahead now the little dog dashed madly, and it was not long before Pollyanna came upon the reason for it all. A man lying motionless at the foot of a steep, overhanging mass of rock, a few yards from the side path. A twig cracked sharply under Pollyanna's foot, and the man turned his head. With a cry of dismay, Pollyanna ran to his side.
"Mr. Pendleton! Oh, are you hurt?"
Hurt? Oh, no. I'm just taking a siesta in the sunshine,"
snapped the man irritably.
"See here. How much do you know? What can you do? Have you got any sense?"
Pollyanna caught her breath with a little gasp, but, as was her habit, she answered the questions literally, one by one.
"Why, Mr. Pendleton, I don't know so very much, and I can't do a great many things, but most of the ladies' aiders, except Mrs. Rawson, said I had real good sense. I heard him say so one day. They didn't know I heard, though."
The man smiled grimly.
There, child, I beg your pardon, I'm sure. It's only this confounded leg of mine. Now listen."
He paused and with some difficulty reached his hand into his trousers pocket and brought out a bunch of keys, singling out one between his thumb and forefinger.
"Straight through the path there, about 5 minutes' walk, is my house. This key will admit you to the side door under the porte-cochere. Do you know what a porte-cochere is?"
"Oh, yes, sir. Auntie has one with a sun parlor over it. That's the roof I slept on. Only I didn't sleep, you know. They found me."
"Eh? Well, when you get into the house, go straight through the vestibule and hall to the door at the end. On the big flat-topped desk in the middle of the room you'll find a telephone. Do you know how to use a telephone?"
"Oh, yes, sir. Why, once when Aunt Polly—"
"Never mind Aunt Polly now,"
cut in the man scowlingly, as he tried to move himself a little.
"Hunt up Dr. Thomas Chilton's number on the card you'll find somewhere around there. It ought to be on the hook down at the side, but it probably won't be. You know a telephone card, I suppose, when you see one?"
"Oh, yes, sir. I just love Aunt Polly's. There's such a lot of queer names and—"
"Tell Dr. Chilton that John Pendleton is at the foot of Little Eagle Ledge in Pendleton Woods with a broken leg, and to come at once with a stretcher and 2 men. He'll know what to do besides that. Tell him to come by the path from the house."
"A broken leg? Oh, Mr. Pendleton, how perfectly awful!"
shuddered Pollyanna.
"But I'm so glad I came. Can't I do—"
Yes, you can, but evidently you won't. Will you go and do what I ask and stop talking?
Moaned the man faintly. And with a little sobbing cry, Pollyanna went. Pollyanna did not stop now to look up at the patches of blue between the sunlit tops of the trees. She kept her eyes on the ground to make sure that no twig nor stone tripped her hurrying feet. It was not long before she came in sight of the house. She had seen it before, though never so near as this. She was almost frightened now at the massiveness of the great pile of gray stone, with its pillared verandas and its imposing entrance. Pausing only a moment, however, she sped across the big neglected lawn and around the house to the side door under the porte-cochere. Her fingers, stiff from their tight clutch upon the keys, were anything but skillful in their efforts to turn the bolt and the lock, but at last the heavy, carved door swung slowly back on its hinges. Pollyanna caught her breath. In spite of her feeling of haste, she paused a moment and looked fearfully through the vestibule to the wide, sombre hall beyond, her thoughts in a whirl. This was John Pendleton's house, the house of mystery, the house into which no one but its master entered, the house which sheltered, somewhere, a skeleton. Yet she, Pollyanna, was expected to enter alone these fearsome rooms, and telephone the doctor that the master of the house lay now. With a little cry, Pollyanna, looking neither to the right nor the left, fairly ran through the hall to the door at the end and opened it. The room was large and sombre, with dark woods and hangings like the hall. But through the west window the sun threw a long shaft of gold across the floor, gleamed dully on the tarnished brass andirons in the fireplace, and touched the nickel of the telephone on the great desk in the middle of the room. It was toward this desk that Pollyanna hurriedly tiptoed. The telephone card was not on its hook. It was on the floor. But Pollyanna found it and ran her shaking forefinger down through the C's to Chilton. In due time she had Dr. Chilton himself at the other end of the wires, and was tremblingly delivering her message and answering the doctor's terse, pertinent questions. This done, she hung up the receiver and drew a long breath of relief. Only a brief glance did Pollyanna give about her. Then, with a confused vision in her eyes of crimson draperies, book-lined walls, a littered floor, an untidy desk, innumerable closed doors, any one of which might conceal a skeleton, and everywhere dust, 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 she fled back through the hall to the great carved door, still half open as she had left it. In what seemed, even to the injured man, an incredibly short time, Pollyanna was back in the woods at the man's side.
"Well, what's the trouble? Couldn't you get in?"
he demanded. Pollyanna opened wide her eyes.
"Why, of course I could. I'm here," she answered. "As if I'd be here if I hadn't got in. And the doctor will be right up just as soon as possible with the men and things. He said he knew just where you were, so I didn't stay to show him. I wanted to be with you."
"Did you?"
smiled the man grimly.
"Well, I can't say I admire your tastes. I should think you might find pleasanter companions."
"Do you mean because you're so cross?"
"Thanks for your frankness. Yes."
Pollyanna laughed softly.
"But you're only cross outside. You aren't cross inside a bit."
"Indeed. How do you know that?"
asked the man, trying to change the position of his head without moving the rest of his body.
"Oh, lots of ways. There, like that. The way you act with the dog," she added, pointing to the long, slender hand that rested on the dog's sleek head near him. "It's funny how dogs and cats know the insides of folks better than other folks do, isn't it? Say, I'm going to hold your head," she finished abruptly.
The man winced several times and groaned once, softly, while the change was being made. But in the end he found Pollyanna's lap a very welcome substitute for the rocky hollow in which his head had lain before.
"Oh, that is better,"
he murmured faintly. He did not speak again for some time. Pollyanna, watching his face, wondered if he were asleep. She did not think he was. He looked as if his lips were tight shut to keep back moans of pain. Pollyanna herself almost cried aloud as she looked at his great, strong body lying there so helpless. One hand, with fingers tightly clenched, lay outflung, motionless. The other, limply open, lay on the dog's head. The dog, his wistful, eager eyes on his master's face, was motionless too. Minute by minute the time passed. The sun dropped lower in the west, and the shadows grew deeper under the trees. Pollyanna sat so still she hardly seemed to breathe. A bird alighted fearlessly within reach of her hand, and a squirrel whisked his bushy tail on a tree branch almost under her nose, yet with his bright little eyes all the while on the motionless dog. At last the dog pricked up his ears and whined softly. Then he gave a short, sharp bark. The next moment Pollyanna heard voices, and very soon their owners appeared, 3 men carrying a stretcher and various other articles. The tallest of the party, a smooth-shaven, kind-eyed man, whom Pollyanna knew by sight as Dr. Chilton, advanced cheerily.
"Well, my little lady, playing nurse?"
"Oh, no, sir," smiled Pollyanna. "I've only held his head. I haven't given him a mite of medicine, but I'm glad I was here."
"So am I," nodded the doctor, as he turned his absorbed attention to the injured man. End of Chapter 13. Recording by The Story Girl. Chapter 14 of Pollyanna by Eleanor H. Porter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by The Story Girl. Chapter 14. Just a Matter of Jelly. Pollyanna was a little late for supper on the night of the accident to John Pendleton, but as it happened, she escaped without reproof. Nancy met her at the door. "Well, if I ain't glad to be setting my 2 eyes on you," she sighed in obvious relief. "It's 6:30. "I know it," admitted Pollyanna anxiously. "But I'm not to blame. Truly I'm not. And I don't think even Aunt Polly will say I am either." "She won't have the chance," retorted Nancy with huge satisfaction. "She's gone."
"Gone?" gasped Pollyanna. "You don't mean that I've driven her away?"
Through Pollyanna's mind at the moment trooped remorseful memories of the morning with its unwanted boy, cat, and dog, and its unwelcome, glad, and forbidden father that would spring to her forgetful little tongue.
"Oh, I didn't drive her away."
"Not much you did," scoffed Nancy. "Her cousin died suddenly down to Boston, and she had to go. She had one of them yeller telegram letters after you went away this afternoon, and she won't be back for 3 days. Now I guess we're glad all right. We'll be keeping house together. Just you and me,
all that time. We will, we will." Pollyanna looked shocked.
"Glad? Oh, Nancy, when it's a funeral?"
"Oh, but 'twa'n't the funeral I was glad for, Miss Pollyanna. It was—" Nancy stopped abruptly. A shrewd twinkle came into her eyes. "Why, Miss Pollyanna, as if it wa'n't yourself that was teaching me to play the game," she reproached her gravely. Pollyanna puckered her forehead into a troubled frown.
"I can't help it, Nancy,"
she argued with a shake of her head.
"It must be that there are some things that 'tisn't right to play the game on, and I'm sure funerals is one of them. There's nothing in a funeral to be glad about."
Nancy chuckled. "We can be glad 'tain't our'n," she observed demurely. But Pollyanna did not hear. She had begun to tell of the accident, and in a moment Nancy, open-mouthed, was listening. At the appointed place the next afternoon, Pollyanna met Jimmy Bean according to agreement. As was to be expected, of course, Jimmy showed keen disappointment that the Ladies' Aid preferred a little India boy to himself.
"Well, maybe 'tis natural," he sighed. "Of course, things you don't know about are always nicer'n things you do. Same as the potato on the other side of the plate is always the biggest. But I wish I looked that way to somebody way off. Wouldn't it be just great now, if only somebody over in India wanted me?"
Pollyanna clapped her hands.
"Why, of course! That's the very thing, Jimmy! I'll write to my Ladies' Aiders about you. They aren't over in India, they're only out west, but that's awful far away just the same. I reckon you'd think so if you'd come all the way here as I did."
Jimmy's face brightened.
"Do you think they would truly take me?" he asked.
"Of course they would. Don't they take little boys in India to bring up? Well, they can just play you are the little India boy this time. I reckon you're far enough away to make a report all right. You wait. I'll write 'em. I'll write Mrs. White. No, I'll write Mrs. Jones. Mrs. White has got the most money, but Mrs. Jones gives the most, which is kind of funny, isn't it, when you think of it? But I reckon some of the Aiders will take you."
"All right. But don't forget to say I'll work for my board and keep," put in Jimmy. "I ain't no beggar, and business is business, even with Ladies' Aiders, I'm thinking."
He hesitated, then added,
"And I suppose I better stay where I be for a spell yet, till you hear."
"Of course,"
nodded Pollyanna emphatically.
"Then I'll know just where to find you. And they'll take you. I'm sure you're far enough away for that. Didn't Aunt Polly take— Say!"
She broke off suddenly.
"Do you suppose I was Aunt Polly's little girl from India?"
"Well, if you ain't the queerest kid,"
grinned Jimmy as he turned away. It was about a week after the accident in Pendleton Woods that Pollyanna said to her aunt one morning,
"Aunt Polly, please, would you mind very much if I took Mrs. Snow's calf's foot jelly this week to someone else? I'm sure Mrs. Snow wouldn't, this once."
"Dear me, Pollyanna, what are you up to now?" sighed her aunt. "You are the most extraordinary child." Pollyanna frowned a little anxiously.
"Aunt Polly, please, what is extraordinary? If you're extraordinary, you can't be ordinary, can you?"
"You certainly cannot."
"Oh, that's all right then. I'm glad I'm extraordinary,"
sighed Pollyanna, her face clearing.
"You see, Mrs. White used to say Mrs. Rawson was a very ordinary woman, and she disliked Mrs. Rawson something awful. They were always Father had, that is, I mean, we had more trouble keeping peace between them than we did between any of the rest of the Aiders,"
corrected Pollyanna, a little breathless from her efforts to steer between the Scylla of her father's past commands in regard to speaking of church quarrels and the Charybdis of her aunt's present commands in regard to speaking of her father.
Yes, well, never mind," interposed Aunt Polly, a trifle impatiently. "You do run on so, Pollyanna, and no matter what we're talking about, you always bring up those ladies' aiders."
"Yes'm,"
smiled Pollyanna cheerfully.
"I reckon I do, maybe. But you see, they used to bring me up and—"
"That will do, Pollyanna," interrupted a cold voice. "Now, what is it about this jelly?"
"Nothing, Aunt Polly, truly, that you would mind, I'm sure. You let me take Jelly to her, so I thought you would to him, this once. You see, broken legs aren't like lifelong invalids, so his won't last forever, as Mrs. Snow's does, and she can have all the rest of the things after just once or twice."
He, broken leg? What are you talking about, Pollyanna?" Pollyanna stared. Then her face relaxed.
"Oh, I forgot. I reckon you didn't know. You see, it happened while you were gone. It was the very day you went that I found him in the woods, you know, and I had to unlock his house and telephone for the men and the doctor and hold his head and everything. And of course then I came away and haven't seen him since. But when Nancy made the jelly for Mrs. Snow this week, I thought how nice it would be if I could take it to him instead of her just this once. Aunt Polly, may I?"
Yes, I suppose so," acquiesced Miss Polly a little wearily. "Who did you say he was?"
"The man. I mean, Mr. John Pendleton."
Miss Polly almost sprang from her chair. "John Pendleton!"
"Yes. Nancy told me his name. Maybe you know him?"
Miss Polly did not answer this. Instead, she asked, "Do you know him?" Pollyanna nodded.
"Oh, yes. He always speaks and smiles, now. He's only cross outside, you know. I'll go and get the jelly. Nancy had it most fixed when I came in,"
finished Pollyanna, already halfway across the room. "Pollyanna, wait!" Miss Polly's voice was suddenly very stern. "I've changed my mind. I would prefer that Mrs. Snow had that jelly today, as usual. That is all. You may go now." Pollyanna's face fell.
"Oh, but Aunt Polly, hers will last. She can always be sick and have things, you know. But his is just a broken leg, and legs don't last. I mean, broken ones. He's had it a whole week now."
"Yes, I remember. I heard Mr. John Pendleton had met with an accident," said Miss Polly a little stiffly. "But I do not care to be sending jelly to John Pendleton, Pollyanna."
"I know he is cross outside," admitted Pollyanna sadly. "So I suppose you don't like him. But I wouldn't say 'twas you said it. I'd say 'twas me. I like him. I'd be glad to send him jelly."
Miss Polly began to shake her head again. Then suddenly she stopped and asked in a curiously quiet voice, "Does he know who you are, Pollyanna?" The little girl sighed.
"I reckon not. I told him my name once, but he never calls me it. Never."
"Does he know where you live?"
"Oh, no, I never told him that."
"Then he doesn't know you're my niece?"
"I don't think so."
For a moment there was silence. Miss Polly was looking at Pollyanna with eyes that did not seem to see her at all. The little girl, shifting impatiently from one small foot to the other, sighed audibly. Then Miss Polly roused herself with a start. "Very well, Pollyanna," she said at last, still in that queer voice, so unlike her own. "You may take the jelly," to Mr. Pendleton, "as your own gift. But understand, I do not send it. Be very sure that he does not think I do."
"Yes'm. No, thank you, Aunt Polly," exulted Pollyanna as she flew through the door.
End of Chapter 14.